Let's get started. Story number 1.
I had always considered myself a rational person, someone who didn't believe in ghosts, spirits, or anything beyond the realm of science. So when my friends invited me to spend the weekend at an old farmhouse they had rented out in the country, I thought it would be a fun and peaceful escape from the city. Little did I know that this weekend would challenge everything I thought I knew about the world. The farmhouse sat on a quiet stretch of land, far from any bustling towns or highways. It had been in the family of the owner for generations, a traditional two-story building with wide porches and tall shuttered windows. My friends, 4 of us in total, arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun began to dip behind the hills, casting an orange glow over the fields. The place looked picturesque, perhaps a bit too much so. As we unloaded the car, I couldn't help but notice how still the air was, almost unnaturally so. There was no sound of birds, no rustling of leaves, just an oppressive silence. Still, I brushed it off as a quirk of the location. We were in the middle of nowhere, after all. Inside, the farmhouse felt old but charming. The wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the smell of aged wood mixed with the faint scent of something I couldn't place, a musty, almost metallic odor. The kitchen was functional, with an old stove that seemed like it hadn't been used in years, and the living room had an antique feel, filled with vintage furniture and portraits of strangers hanging on the walls. There was a fireplace, cold and unused, and thick, heavy curtains blocking out most of the light from the outside. "Can you believe how beautiful this place is?" Sarah, one of my friends, said as she stood by the window. She was the one who had organized the trip, always looking for new, off-the-beaten-path destinations. "Yeah, it's nice," I replied, though something about the place unsettled me. It wasn't anything I could point to exactly, just a vague feeling of discomfort, like something was off. That night, after dinner, we sat around the living room talking and drinking wine. The conversation turned to the house itself, and Sarah mentioned that the owner had told her a little about its history when she'd booked the reservation. Apparently, the farmhouse had been in the family for generations, and several people had lived and died there over the years. "There's this one story," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "about a woman named Eleanor who used to live here. She died under mysterious circumstances, and they say her spirit still haunts the place." I rolled my eyes, trying to suppress the unease that crept up my spine. Ghost stories were always exaggerated, I told myself. Still, I couldn't ignore the strange feeling that had settled in my chest. It wasn't just the house, it was something in the air, something intangible. The evening passed uneventfully, with laughter and lighthearted conversation, but as we all started to head to bed, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The house creaked and groaned, the wind howling outside as the temperature dropped. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I had always been the kind of person who could sleep anywhere. But that night, I found myself tossing and turning. The room was freezing, despite the thick quilt on the bed. My thoughts kept returning to the stories Sarah had mentioned. Eleanor, the mysterious death, the unsettling silence of the house. At around 3 a.m., I woke up to a strange sound. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, a soft scratching noise, like fingernails running along wood. My heart began to race. I lay still, listening, straining to hear the sound again. There it was, faint but undeniable, coming from the hallway outside my room. I tried to brush it off as an animal or the house settling, but the sound continued, growing louder and more rhythmic. It was coming closer. My mind raced as I debated whether to get up and investigate. I wasn't about to wake the others. They would think I was being paranoid, but the noise was now unmistakable, the scratching like a deliberate attempt to get my attention. With a deep breath, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and crept toward the door. I cracked it open just a fraction, enough to peer into the hallway. The house was dark, but moonlight filtered in through the windows, casting long, eerie shadows along the floor. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, near the staircase, there was a figure standing in the shadows. It was tall, thin, and completely still, its outline barely visible against the dim light. My heart skipped a beat. I blinked, unsure if I was seeing things, but when I looked again, it was still there. I slammed the door shut, my breath coming in short gasps. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. What the hell had I just seen? My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, trying to call one of my friends. But when I looked at the screen, I realized it was 3:30 a.m., and no one would answer. The noise outside my door had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Slowly, I turned off the light and pulled the covers up to my chin, trying to force myself back to sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, the image of the figure in the hallway replayed in my mind. The next morning, I didn't tell anyone about what had happened. I convinced myself it was a product of my imagination. A half dream, perhaps. After all, we had all been drinking the night before. But as the day wore on, things began to feel even stranger. We went into town for breakfast and talked to some locals who were friendly but distant. One old woman sitting on her porch caught my eye when I mentioned the farmhouse. Her expression hardened and she said, "You should leave that house before it gets dark." I laughed it off, but something about her words stuck with me. That evening, as the sun began to set, I started to feel the same unease that I had the night before. The house seemed to have a life of its own, creaking and groaning as if it were breathing. The temperature dropped suddenly, and I shivered, even though I had put on a sweater. I tried to distract myself by sitting with my friends in the living room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That was when I heard it. The same scratching sound, this time much louder. It was coming from the ceiling, as though something were dragging across the floorboards above us. My friends didn't hear it at first, but I could feel my heart racing again. I stood up, my hands trembling. "I'm going to check the attic," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. They looked at me with amusement. "Are you sure you want to go up there?" Sarah asked, raising an eyebrow. "I heard that's where Eleanor died." I didn't answer. I just walked to the attic door, which was at the far end of the hallway. The door creaked open easily, and I climbed up the narrow staircase. The attic was dark, filled with old furniture and boxes covered in dust. The air was thick with the musty smell of decay, and the scratching noise was louder now, almost deafening. As I moved deeper into the attic, I felt something cold brush against my skin. I spun around, but there was nothing there. And then I saw it, a small wooden chest tucked away in the corner. It was old and worn, the wood faded with age. The scratching noise was coming from inside the chest. My heart hammered in my chest as I approached it. I knelt down and opened the chest, but instead of finding something inside, I was met with an overwhelming wave of cold air. The temperature in the attic dropped drastically, and I felt a presence, something standing just behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know it was there. Suddenly, the door to the attic slammed shut with a loud bang, trapping me inside. Story, the end.
Story number 2.
It started as a typical move-in experience for me. I had recently relocated to a small town for work, and I was looking for an affordable place to live while I got settled. After searching through various listings, I found a charming old house at the edge of town that seemed perfect for my needs. The rent was surprisingly low, but the landlord assured me that it was simply due to the house's age and the fact that it had been vacant for a few months. I didn't mind the house being a bit rundown. In fact, I liked the character it seemed to have. The first night I spent there, I noticed the house felt unusually quiet. Unnaturally so, like the stillness hung heavy in the air. But I wrote it off as me adjusting to the new space. I unpacked, made dinner, and watched some TV before heading to bed. That night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to a strange sound. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, like footsteps, light but deliberate. I sat up in bed, listening carefully. The sound came from the hallway just outside my bedroom door. My heart began to race. I didn't want to be paranoid, but I was the only one in the house. I got up and cautiously opened the door, but there was nothing. The hallway was empty, the house still. I closed the door and tried to tell myself it was nothing. A creaky floorboard, perhaps, or the house settling. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, trying to fall back asleep. The next morning, I mentioned the noise to the landlord, but he only shrugged it off, saying it was probably just the house's age. Still, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. Over the next few days, I settled into the routine of living there, but the strange occurrences continued. The footsteps would come and go, always at night, always when I was alone. Sometimes I would hear faint whispers, too faint to make out the words, but unmistakable. The air in the house also felt different, colder than usual, as if someone was standing just behind me, watching. I started to wonder if I was just imagining things, but then one evening, something happened that made it all feel too real. I had just come home from work and was about to sit down for dinner when I heard a noise from upstairs. It was the sound of something moving, like dragging or scraping. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. I quickly put the plate down and went up the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the silence. When I reached the top of the stairs, the noise stopped. I checked each room, empty. But as I walked toward the farthest room at the end of the hall, I felt a cold breeze rush past me. The window was closed, yet the air in the room was freezing. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye, a small framed photograph on the floor. I hadn't noticed it before, and I definitely hadn't placed it there. I bent down to pick it up, and my stomach lurched when I saw the image. It was a black and white photograph of a family. A man, a woman, and 2 children, a boy and a girl. The photo was taken in the very room I was standing in. The woman's face was familiar. I couldn't place it, but there was something about her eyes that made my skin crawl. I dropped the photo back on the floor, my heart racing. I looked around the room again, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. I quickly left, not wanting to stay there any longer. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The whispers grew louder, and the footsteps became more frequent. I started to see things. Flickers of movement in the corner of my vision, shadows that seemed to dart out of sight when I turned my head. One night, I woke up to the distinct feeling of someone sitting at the edge of my bed. I could feel the weight of it. Someone was there, breathing quietly. I jerked upright, but when I turned on the lamp, the bed was empty. My breath was shallow, and my heart hammered in my chest. I couldn't stay in the house anymore. I called the landlord the next morning, but he wasn't much help. He said the house had been vacant for a long time and didn't have any known issues with it. But he mentioned almost casually that the family who had lived there before me had experienced some strange things too. He didn't go into detail, but something about the way he said it made my stomach churn. It was as if he knew more than he was letting on. I decided to investigate the house's history. After a few phone calls, I found out that the previous tenants had lived there for years. The family had been well known in the town until they suddenly vanished without a trace. The police had investigated, but there were no leads. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from the house just before they disappeared, but no one knew what had happened to them. I couldn't stop thinking about the photo I had found, the family in it. The woman, whose face I now realized had an eerie resemblance to my own. I couldn't shake the thought that I was being drawn into something I didn't understand, something I had no control over. I kept seeing that woman's face in my dreams, and when I would wake up, the whispers would start again, soft, mournful whispers. I couldn't stay there anymore, so I packed my things and left. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance back at the house one last time. The windows were dark, but I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in the upper window, watching me leave. I never found out exactly what happened to the family, and I never returned to that house. But sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I still hear the whispers and I still see the woman's face, watching me from the shadows. Story the end.
Story number 3.
When I was a child, my family moved to a small town on the outskirts of the city. The house we moved into was old, but beautiful. It was a 2-story Victorian-style home, tucked away on a quiet street lined with overgrown trees. The moment I stepped inside, I knew something was different. The air felt heavy, almost as if it was holding its breath. My parents didn't seem to notice anything strange. They were busy with unpacking and getting settled in, while my younger brother and I explored the house, eager to make it feel like home. The house had a charm to it, even though there were areas that looked worn and neglected. There was a large staircase that creaked with every step, a narrow hallway that led to a small room at the end of the hall, and a basement that we were forbidden to go near. I don't know why, but there was always something unsettling about that room at the end of the hall. My brother and I would joke about it, calling it the scary room, but neither of us dared go inside. The door was always slightly ajar, as if it wanted to be discovered, yet neither of us felt brave enough to push it open. Days passed, and we grew accustomed to the house. The creaking floors, the sound of wind howling through the old windows, these became part of our daily lives. But then, one evening, something happened that I can't explain. I was sitting in the living room, reading a book. It was around 9 p.m., just as the sky outside was turning dark. The house felt colder than usual, and I noticed that the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow longer as the night wore on. I chalked it up to the old house, as the heating system was unreliable at best. As I read, I started to hear a soft sound coming from upstairs. It was faint at first, just a soft tapping, like someone gently knocking on the wall. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was the house settling, but the sound grew louder. It was rhythmic, deliberate. My heart began to race. I stood up and hesitated, wondering if I should check on my brother. But before I could make up my mind, the tapping stopped, replaced by something else, a faint whisper, barely audible, coming from the direction of the hallway. The whisper was so soft that at first I thought it was my imagination, but then it came again, clearer this time. Help. Me. I froze, my body going rigid. I wanted to call out to ask if anyone was there, but I couldn't move. The whisper continued, growing louder, and it seemed to come from the very walls of the house. It felt as though the house itself was alive, like it was trying to communicate with me. I took a deep breath and, against my better judgment, walked towards the stairs. I knew my brother was supposed to be in his room, so I decided to check on him first. But when I reached the top of the stairs, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The hallway light, which was always turned off when we went to bed, was on. And at the end of the hall, the door to that room, the one we had always avoided, was wide open. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The air around me grew even colder, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I don't know why, but I felt drawn to that room. I told myself it was just my imagination, that it was nothing more than the house settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me in there. I took slow, cautious steps toward the door, my breath catching in my throat. As I reached it, I paused, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The whispering started again, louder now, and it felt as though the voice was coming from inside the room. Help me. I pushed the door open, and as soon as I did, the temperature in the hallway dropped. A gust of cold air hit me, and I stumbled back, almost falling. But then I saw it. The room was empty, except for a few old, broken pieces of furniture covered in dust. But there in the center of the room was a large mirror. It was an antique, the kind you might see in a museum. It was beautifully ornate, with intricate carvings around the edges. But the moment I looked into it, something changed. At first, I thought I was seeing things, but then I realized that my reflection wasn't quite right. It was off. The image in the mirror was distorted, like someone had smeared it. My face looked pale, almost as though I was sick. And then I saw it. There was a figure standing behind me, a tall figure, cloaked in shadows. I turned around quickly, but the room was empty. The figure was gone. My heart was racing, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I took a step back from the mirror, my hands trembling, and then I heard it, a soft whisper. But this time, it wasn't from the hallway. It came from the mirror itself. Help me. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, staring at the mirror, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The whisper faded, and the room fell silent again. Slowly, I stepped back out into the hallway and closed the door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the mirror, its cold, empty eyes staring back at me. I wanted to tell my parents, but I didn't know how. How could I explain something like that? I didn't even know what I had seen. The next morning, I went downstairs to find my brother, hoping that he hadn't experienced anything strange. But when I found him, he looked pale, his face drawn with fear. "Did you hear it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The whispering? I froze. I hadn't told him anything, and yet he knew. He went on to explain that he had heard the same thing I had, whispers, soft and distant, coming from the hallway at night. He had tried to ignore it, but it kept getting louder. It wasn't until he heard a voice calling his name that he finally ran to my room for comfort. At that moment, I knew something was wrong with the house. Something dark and sinister lingered there. waiting. We never spoke about it again, but that night I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The house seemed to breathe around us, the walls whispering in the dark. Every time I passed that room at the end of the hall, I could feel the air grow colder, the silence growing heavier. I never went near the room again. Over time, my family moved away and we left the house behind. But even now, years later, I sometimes hear the faintest whisper in the back of my mind, calling for help. And when I look in the mirror, I wonder if I'll ever see that figure again. Story, the end.
Story number 4.
I had just moved into a small town, eager for a fresh start. After a difficult breakup and a job change, I thought a new environment would do me good. I found a small, quaint house on the outskirts of town, nestled between towering pines and oaks. The place was older, but it had character. Wooden floors, a cozy fireplace, and a large winding staircase that led to the second floor. It seemed perfect, and the price was incredibly low. The landlord, a quiet woman named Mrs. Whitaker, seemed pleasant enough. She told me the house had been in her family for generations, but it had been vacant for the past few years. When I asked her if anything strange had ever happened there, she simply smiled and said, "Houses like these have their secrets, but it's a good home. You'll see." I moved in that weekend, and the first few days were uneventful. I unpacked, set up furniture, and spent my evenings exploring the small town. But it didn't take long for me to feel the weight of something else in the house. It started with small things, objects being moved when I was sure I hadn't touched them, doors creaking open on their own, and that persistent feeling that I was being watched, even when I was alone. I brushed it off as just my imagination, the kind of paranoia that comes with a new place. But then came the whispers. It was late one evening when I first heard them. I had just finished dinner and was sitting in the living room, reading a book. The house was completely still, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floors. But then, faintly at first, I heard a voice, soft and low, as though someone was speaking just outside the room. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a conversation, like a murmur that kept repeating itself. I froze, straining to listen, but the sound was gone as quickly as it had come. My heart was racing, but I convinced myself it was nothing, just the wind, maybe, or the house settling. But that night, the whispers returned. This time they were louder, and I could hear the words clearly. "Help me. Help me. Help me." The voice was pleading, desperate. I sat up in bed, my ears straining to catch every word. I thought about calling Mrs. Whitaker to ask her about the strange occurrences, but I was too embarrassed. What if I sounded crazy? The next day, I decided to investigate. I asked around the town and spoke with a few of the locals. No one seemed to know much about the house's history, except that it had always been in Mrs. Whitaker's family. But one elderly woman, Mrs. Granger, told me something that sent a chill down my spine. "Oh, that house," she said with a knowing look. "It's been through a lot. There was a fire in the 1920s, and before that, a terrible tragedy. A young woman named Eliza lived there. She was a beautiful girl, full of life, but she vanished one night, never to be seen again. The family searched for her, but they never found her. Some say she still haunts that house. You'd do well to stay away from the attic, dear." I didn't know what to make of it, but her words lingered in my mind as I returned to the house that evening. As I sat in the living room, trying to shake the unease that had taken root, I heard the whispers again. This time, they were coming from the direction of the attic. I stood frozen, my heart thundering in my chest. The whispers seemed to beckon me, and against my better judgment, I found myself walking toward the stairs. The attic was small and cramped, with slanted walls and exposed beams. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of something old and musty lingered in the corners. I flicked the light on, and the shadows danced on the walls, casting eerie shapes. I could feel my pulse quicken as I walked deeper into the attic. There, in the far corner, I saw an old wooden chest. It was small and weathered, covered in cobwebs. As I approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The whispers had grown louder now, almost frantic, urging me closer. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of me. I bent down and opened the chest. Inside, there was a bundle of old, tattered letters tied with a piece of string. They were yellowed with age, the paper brittle to the touch. I slowly untied the string and unfolded the top letter. The handwriting was elegant, delicate even, but the words sent a shiver down my spine. My dearest Eliza, I fear that something terrible has happened. I heard her crying last night, her voice calling for help. She was so alone, so frightened. I do not know what to do. My breath caught in my throat as I read the rest of the letter. It spoke of Eliza, a young woman who had been confined to the house, isolated by her family. The letters described her strange behavior, her fear of something unseen that she believed was following her. The last letter was dated the day before she vanished. It spoke of her intentions to escape the house, to run from whatever was haunting her. Suddenly, I heard a soft thud behind me. I whirled around, my heart racing. The attic door, which I was certain I had left closed, was now wide open. I could feel the temperature drop, a cold draft sweeping through the room. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, and I could make out a word: run. I didn't need any more encouragement. My mind screamed at me to leave, and I bolted from the attic, not daring to look back. I stumbled down the stairs, breathless, my heart hammering in my chest. As I reached the bottom, the front door slammed shut on its own with a deafening bang. I ran outside into the cool night air and didn't stop until I reached the edge of the property. I stood there for a long time, staring back at the house. From the window, I saw a faint light flicker, as though someone was standing in the dark, watching me. I never returned to the house after that night. I moved into an apartment in town, far from the old house on the outskirts. But even now, sometimes when I'm lying in bed, I can still hear the whispers. Faint, like a distant memory. Help me. Help me. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I had always been skeptical about ghosts. I grew up in a practical household where discussions of the supernatural were quickly dismissed as nonsense, just stories to scare children. I didn't believe in things I couldn't explain, and I had always prided myself on my rational mind. But that changed one winter night when I moved into an old house on the outskirts of a small town. The house was charming in its own way. Built in the early 1900s, with dark wooden floors, tall windows, and a high vaulted ceiling in the living room. It had been vacant for several months before I found it, and I was drawn to its character. The rent was cheaper than I expected, but the landlord, Mr. Henderson, was upfront about it. It's an old house, he told me with a wry smile. Lots of history, but the place is solid, nothing to worry about. I was only looking for a temporary place while I figured out my next move. I didn't think much of Mr. Henderson's odd warning about the house's history. I'd heard stories about houses with a past before, but I didn't let it bother me. After all, I was an adult, and I wasn't afraid of a few creaks in the floorboards. The first few days were uneventful. I moved in, unpacked, and settled into the small town. But as the nights went on, something felt off. I couldn't explain it. I would be lying in bed, just on the edge of sleep, when I'd hear footsteps in the hall. I'd sit up, listening, but there was never anyone there. The floors would creak as though someone was walking across them, but the house was empty. At first, I thought I was just imagining things. Old houses settle and sounds echo through the walls. But the noises continued, always at night, always when the house was completely still. Sometimes I would wake up to a shadowy figure standing at the foot of my bed, but when I blinked, it would be gone. I told myself it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One night, I woke up to the sound of someone whispering. It was soft, almost like a hum, but it was unmistakable. The voice wasn't clear at first, but it seemed to be calling my name, low and persistent. I turned on the lamp beside my bed, my heart racing, but there was no one there. The whispering stopped immediately, and the silence felt suffocating. I tried to push it out of my mind, but I couldn't. I couldn't shake the unease that settled over me. Every night, the whispers would return, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, but always there. It felt like someone was trying to communicate with me, but the messages were never clear. I couldn't sleep, and I found myself becoming more and more paranoid. I called my friend Lucy one afternoon, and when I told her about the strange occurrences, she was skeptical too. But she agreed to visit the house with me that weekend. I didn't know why I needed someone to be with me, but I felt like I needed a witness. Maybe I was going crazy. Maybe I needed someone to tell me I wasn't. That Saturday, Lucy and I spent the day going through the house. She didn't seem to notice anything strange at first, and I started to wonder if I had imagined it all. We sat in the living room for a while, chatting and laughing, until the evening set in and the light began to fade. That was when the temperature in the room dropped. It wasn't a gradual thing, but sudden and noticeable. I glanced at Lucy, who was already looking around, her brow furrowed. "Did you feel that?" she asked, her voice tight. I nodded, feeling a chill creep up my spine. The air felt dense. The air felt dense, almost suffocating, like the room was holding its breath. Suddenly, the whispers began again. Soft at first, but then growing louder. I couldn't make out the words, but they were unmistakable. I stood up quickly, heart pounding in my chest, and moved toward the hallway. Lucy followed me, her face pale. I could feel the presence before I saw anything. It was like the air had changed, becoming thick with something I couldn't explain. The floor creaked under our feet as we moved toward the stairs, which led up to the second floor. "Let's check the attic," Lucy said, her voice trembling. She didn't have to say it. I felt drawn to the attic, too. Something in the house was pulling me toward it, like an invisible force. We climbed the narrow staircase, and as we reached the top, the air grew colder. I reached for the light switch, but when I flipped it, nothing happened. The room was pitch black. We stood there for a moment, the only sound the thumping of my heart in my chest. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. A dark shape, something standing just at the edge of the shadows. I turned to Lucy, but she was staring at the figure in the corner, her face frozen in terror. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. The figure seemed to grow larger, more defined, as if it was coming toward us. And then I heard the voice. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was clear, loud, urgent. "Get out!" The words sent a jolt through me, and I turned and ran down the stairs, pulling Lucy behind me. We didn't stop until we were outside, standing in the yard, gasping for breath. "What the hell was that?" Lucy asked, her voice shaky. I didn't know how to answer. The house was silent now, but the feeling that something was still there, watching us, lingered in the air. We didn't go back inside. That night, I stayed at Lucy's house, too afraid to return to the place that had once felt so safe. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing. Something was in that house. And it didn't want us there. The next day, I called Mr. Henderson. I told him everything, from the whispers to the shadow in the attic. He was quiet on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I thought he was going to hang up. Then he spoke. "You should have left when I told you," he said, his voice low and distant. "That house has a history. A long one. Eliza, she never left." I asked him who Eliza was, but he wouldn't say. He only told me to leave, that the house had claimed too many people before me. I didn't need any more convincing. I packed my things and left that afternoon, never looking back. I tried to get in touch with the local authorities to find out more about Eliza, but every inquiry seemed to be met with strange resistance. No one wanted to talk about her. It was like she had been erased from the town's history. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that house. I never went back, and I don't know if I ever will, but sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear the whispers. "Get out." Story the end.
Story number 6.
When I was in my early 20s, I had the opportunity to move into an old house in a quiet rural town. The house was a 2-story, weathered structure built in the late 1800s. The rent was incredibly cheap, and as someone just starting out, that was a huge selling point. The house was beautiful in a rustic way, but there was an undeniable sense of age to it, and the air always felt slightly colder than the rest of the neighborhood. The first week was uneventful. I was busy getting settled in, unpacking boxes, and getting used to the creaky floors and the various oddities the house had to offer. There was a small room at the back of the house that had a door leading to the basement, but it was locked. The landlord, a kind, elderly man, had warned me never to try and open it. "Best not to go poking around in there," he'd said with a cryptic smile. I took his advice and didn't think much more about it. The house was mostly quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards settling or the wind rattling the old windows. But there was something about the quiet that seemed unnatural. The stillness felt like it was pressing in on me, as though the house itself was holding its breath. It made me uneasy, but I figured it was just the isolation. The house was far from the nearest neighbor, and the town itself was small, with little activity after dusk. Around the second week, strange things started to happen. At first, I thought I was imagining things, small sounds like faint knocks on the walls or a whisper carried on the wind. But it was when I started hearing footsteps late at night that I began to question what was happening. I'd be lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I would hear soft footsteps walking across the floor above me. I'd lie there, frozen, listening to the sound of boots dragging across the floor, the creak of wood as if someone were pacing back and forth. Every time I would convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, or maybe the house settling. But the sound was too deliberate, too consistent to ignore. The first time I went up to check, I found nothing. The upstairs was empty, and the rooms were dark and still, as they should have been. There was no one there, and I almost felt foolish for even entertaining the idea that something was wrong. I told myself it was just the house. Old houses make noise, after all. But the next night, the footsteps came again. It wasn't long before I started noticing other strange things. The lights would flicker at odd times, and objects would be out of place when I came back into a room. Sometimes the door to the basement would be slightly ajar, even though I had locked it earlier in the day. I'd push it shut again, convinced I must have forgotten to lock it properly, but it would always happen again. The unease began to grow into something more tangible, more real. One evening, I was sitting in the living room, reading a book, when I heard the unmistakable sound of someone dragging something heavy across the floor. The noise came from upstairs, followed by the sound of a door creaking open. I set my book down, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I hesitated for a moment, then grabbed a flashlight and headed for the stairs. When I reached the top, the house was silent. There was no sound of dragging or footsteps, and all the doors were shut. I checked the door to the basement, which was locked tight as always, and then went into each room upstairs. They were empty. Nothing seemed out of place. I returned to the living room, shaking my head at myself. It was just the house, I told myself. It was just old and creaky, and my mind was playing tricks. But then it happened again, and again. One night, I was lying in bed when I heard the dragging noise again, this time much louder. I sat up, heart pounding in my chest. The noise was coming from the hallway, just outside my room. I got up and crept to the door, listening. The dragging was joined by a faint scratching sound, like nails on wood. I was frozen, my breath shallow, the only sound in the house the scratching, which was now moving closer to my door. I didn't know what to do. I could hear it clearly now. Something was definitely moving down the hallway. I wanted to scream, to run, but I felt paralyzed, rooted to the spot. The scratching continued, drawing closer, and I could feel my pulse racing in my ears. Finally, I gathered the courage to open the door. The hallway was empty. But when I looked down the stairs, something caught my eye. The basement door was slightly open again. I didn't know what to think. The unease I had been feeling for weeks intensified, and for the first time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. I went back into my room, locking the door behind me, and spent the night wide awake, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, listening for any sign of movement. The next morning, I went downstairs and tried to distract myself with breakfast, but I couldn't focus. The house felt oppressive, like it was closing in on me. After I ate, I stood in the living room, staring at the door to the basement. Something was telling me I needed to go down there. I needed to see for myself what was causing all this noise, all this unease. I wasn't sure why I felt so compelled, but I walked over to the door and hesitated. The lock was old, rusted, but it clicked open easily. The door creaked loudly as I pulled it open, and a blast of cold air hit me. The stairs leading down were shrouded in darkness, but I grabbed a flashlight and stepped forward. The air grew colder the further I descended, and I could feel my breath condensing in front of me. The basement was a large, empty space, filled with cobwebs and old furniture covered in sheets. It smelled musty, like old books and damp earth. There were boxes stacked in the corners, and a strange, hollow feeling hung in the air. I walked slowly, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. My heart was racing, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up as I moved deeper into the basement. Then I saw it, a large antique mirror standing against the wall. It was old, the wood around the frame intricate, and yet there was something unsettling about it. It seemed out of place in the dimly lit basement. I walked toward it, my flashlight shaking in my hand. As I got closer, I could feel a coldness emanating from the mirror, as though it was absorbing the warmth from the air. I reached out to touch the glass, and the moment my fingers made contact, the flashlight flickered and went out. I stood there in complete darkness, and that's when I heard it. A low, guttural whisper. It was coming from the mirror. "Get out!" The voice was raspy, cold, and somehow hollow. I didn't know what it was or where it came from, but I didn't wait to find out. I turned and ran up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. From that night on, I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I moved out within the week, leaving everything behind. The house was sold not long after, but I've never forgotten that mirror, or the feeling that something was watching me from inside it. To this day, I can still hear that whisper when I close my eyes. Get out. Story the end.
Story number 7.
When I was 18, I moved into a small apartment in an old building in the city. It was affordable, which was important since I was just starting college, and it seemed perfect for someone like me. Quiet, somewhat isolated, and away from the busy streets. The landlord, a grizzled older man, had shown me the apartment and promised me it was a peaceful place. He mentioned that it had a history, but didn't seem to bother him, so it didn't bother me either. What struck me more was how much of the building had that old, creaky charm. Wooden floors, old brass doorknobs, and faded wallpaper that seemed like it had been there for decades. It wasn't long after I moved in that I started to notice the strange things. The first incident occurred on the second night after I'd moved in. I was still unpacking and hadn't fully settled into the place. I was exhausted from the move and schoolwork, and after a long day, I decided to go to bed early. I turned off the lights, curled up under the blankets, and shut my eyes. But just as I was drifting off, I heard it. A soft tapping, like a fingernail gently tapping against wood. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just the old pipes or the building settling, but then it happened again. The tapping continued, rhythmic and steady. It didn't sound like it was coming from the walls or pipes. It was coming from somewhere else, somewhere closer. The tapping came from just outside my bedroom door. It sounded like someone was standing there, waiting. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was the neighbors, I thought. Maybe it was just someone walking down the hall, their shoes lightly hitting the floor. But then, the door slowly creaked open. I froze, staring at the gap between the door and the frame. I hadn't opened it, and the landlord had given me the keys, so it couldn't have been anyone else. The only people who had access to the apartment were me and him, and he wouldn't come over without telling me first. The door remained open just a crack, and I could see nothing but the darkness of the hallway outside. The silence stretched on, and I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing. I got out of bed and slowly closed the door, locking it behind me, and tried to convince myself that it was nothing. That night, I slept with the lights on. The days that followed were uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right in the apartment. I began to notice small things, things moving when I wasn't looking, shadows flickering in the corners of my vision, whispers in the silence when there was no one else around. A few nights later, I was working late on my homework when I heard the distinct sound of footsteps approaching my door. I could hear them as clear as day, slow, measured steps, as if someone were walking deliberately toward me. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart raced as the footsteps grew louder, closer. I stood up, my legs trembling, and I opened the door quickly, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. By this time, I was starting to feel paranoid. I wasn't sure if I was hearing things or if the apartment truly was haunted. I decided to confront the landlord about it, but when I asked him, he just gave me a strange, almost sad look. "You're not the first one to feel it," he said cryptically. "This building has seen a lot in its time. It's old, and there are stories. I'd suggest you just ignore it. It doesn't mean any harm." I wasn't sure what to make of that, but I decided to try and ignore the strange occurrences. But then things started to escalate. One night, I woke up to the sound of someone crying. Soft, muffled sobs, as if someone was sitting in the corner of my room. I could feel the tears in my own eyes, and for a brief moment, I thought it might be me. Dreams can be strange like that, can't they? But when I opened my eyes, I was wide awake. I looked around the room, my heart thudding in my chest. I couldn't see anything. The room was dark, save for the sliver of moonlight coming through the window. The sobs continued, quiet and heartbroken. I turned on the light, and for the briefest of moments, I thought I saw a figure standing in the corner. A woman, hunched over, her face obscured by long, tangled hair. But when I blinked, she was gone. The crying stopped, and I was left alone in the eerie silence of my room. That morning, I decided I had had enough. I couldn't keep living in a place that made me feel this way, where I heard things that couldn't be explained and saw things that weren't really there. But before I packed up and left, I decided to search the building's history. I went to the local library and scoured through old records, hoping to find an explanation. That's when I learned the truth. The building had been home to a family many years ago. The woman who had lived in the apartment I now occupied had been married to a man who worked long hours, leaving her alone for days at a time. She had become deeply lonely, and rumors spread that she had fallen into a deep depression. One evening, neighbors heard her screaming, but when they rushed to the building, it was too late. The woman had hanged herself in her own bedroom. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the words. It was her, I realized. It was her I had been hearing. I knew then that I couldn't stay any longer. The place had become too much for me. I couldn't handle the cold drafts, the whispers, and the feeling of being watched. I packed up my things that night, and I didn't look back. As I walked out of the apartment for the last time, I heard one final thing. The sound of a door softly closing behind me, like someone was bidding me farewell. I never went back to that building. I don't know if the woman's spirit still lingers there, but I hope she finds peace wherever she is. The sounds stopped the moment I left, and I've never experienced anything like it again. But every now and then, when I'm alone in my new place, I catch the faintest sound of crying in the silence. It's always so soft, I wonder if I imagined it. But then I remember that other apartment, and I wonder if the woman is still searching for someone to hear her. Story, the end.
Story number 8.
I had always been a bit of a skeptic when it came to ghost stories. I grew up in a small town where everyone had their share of spooky tales, but I never gave them much thought. My grandmother, however, was different. She was a firm believer, and every time I visited her, she'd share her favorite ghost stories with me, stories about spirits who refused to leave, who lingered in old houses, or who returned to settle unfinished business. I listened politely, but I never thought much of them. That all changed when I moved into a new apartment in a different town. It wasn't a particularly old building, but it had an unsettling atmosphere that I couldn't quite place. The apartment was small, just a one-bedroom on the second floor of a quiet building. The rent was affordable, and I was looking for somewhere to settle after a recent breakup, so it seemed perfect. The landlord, a friendly woman named Mrs. Thompson, gave me the keys and told me that the previous tenant had moved out recently, but there was nothing to be concerned about. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent my time unpacking and adjusting to my new routine. But as the days went on, strange things started to happen. At first, it was small things. Lights flickering, the air growing inexplicably cold in certain parts of the apartment, strange sounds at night that I couldn't explain. I thought I was just adjusting to the new space, or maybe there was something wrong with the electrical wiring. I tried not to think too much of it. Then, one night, I was sitting in the living room, reading a book, when I heard a soft knock at the door. It was late, around 11 p.m., and I wasn't expecting anyone. I stood up, confused, and walked over to the door. When I opened it, there was no one there. Just the quiet of the hallway. I closed the door, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I had this inexplicable sensation that someone was watching me, but when I looked around, the apartment was empty. I shrugged it off and went back to my book, but then, about 20 minutes later, the knock came again. This time, it was more persistent. 3 sharp knocks, like someone was eager to get in. My heart began to race, but I didn't want to overreact. I opened the door again, but once again, no one was there. That's when I started to get uneasy. I told myself it was probably just the wind, or maybe a neighbor playing a prank. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Over the next few days, things only got stranger. I began to notice that objects were moving on their own. I'd leave my kitchen counter clean, only to come back and find that a dish had been placed on the table, or a chair had been pulled out slightly from the table. At first, I thought I was just forgetful, that I was moving things without realizing it. But after a while, I couldn't deny that something was going on. One evening, after work, I returned to the apartment and found the front door slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it when I left. My pulse quickened as I pushed the door open, my mind racing with possibilities. Could someone have broken in? I stepped inside, cautiously, and called out. No answer. The apartment was completely still. I checked each room, but nothing seemed disturbed. Still, the door had been open, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I decided to go to bed early, hoping a good night's sleep would calm my nerves. But as I lay in bed, I heard a soft sound, faint but distinct, a quiet whisper. It wasn't a voice I recognized, just a soft, murmuring noise. I turned over in bed, hoping to ignore it, but the whispering grew louder, and I realized it was coming from the corner of the room. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. There was no one there, but the whispering continued. I turned on the lamp beside the bed, trying to shake off the fear that gripped me. The room was empty, just as I expected, but the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to be coming from all around me, swirling in the air. They were too soft to make out the words, but they were unmistakable, like someone was right next to me, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I didn't know what to do. I thought about leaving the apartment, but where would I go? I had already paid rent for the month, and I didn't want to seem paranoid. So I decided to do what any rational person would do. I called Mrs. Thompson. "Hello," she answered, her voice calm but curious. "Hi, Mrs. Thompson," I began, trying to sound casual. "I'm having some issues with the apartment. Strange noises, things moving on their own. I was wondering if anything weird has happened here before." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then she spoke, her voice lower than before. "You're not the first one," she said, almost in a whisper. "There was a tenant before you who experienced similar things. She said she heard whispers too, and things moving around the apartment." I felt my stomach drop. "What happened to her?" "She left," Mrs. Thompson said softly. "She packed up one night and never came back. I don't know where she went. She didn't want to talk about it. But I can tell you this, the building's old. It's got a history. People have lived there for decades, and some of them don't leave right away." I didn't know what to say. Mrs. Thompson didn't offer any comfort, and I realized that I might be on my own in this. The next few days were filled with increasing dread. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and I could almost make out a name, Emma. I didn't know anyone named Emma. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but I started to feel the presence of someone who had been in that apartment long before I ever moved in. One night, as I sat in the living room, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow moved across the wall, stretching impossibly long as if something or someone was walking by. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. I could feel my heartbeat thumping in my chest, and the whispers began again, this time louder than ever, accompanied by a sudden, biting chill in the air. I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed my things and left that night, not caring that it was late or that I hadn't given notice. I just needed to get out. When I called Mrs. Thompson the next morning to let her know I was leaving, she didn't sound surprised. She simply said, "I thought you might." I never found out the full story about the apartment or the tenant before me. I left that town and moved somewhere far away, hoping to escape whatever had followed me. But sometimes in the quiet of the night, when I'm alone, I still hear those whispers, soft, distant, calling my name. Emma. Story the end.
Story number 9.
It was late summer when I first moved into my apartment, a small unit on the third floor of an old brick building on the edge of town. The place wasn't much to look at. Cracked walls, creaky floors, and windows that didn't quite seal right, but it was all I could afford at the time. I was young, fresh out of college, and the idea of living on my own was thrilling. The landlord, an elderly woman named Mrs. Matthews, had shown me the place and explained the quirks of the building with a tired smile. There's one thing I should mention, she said hesitantly as she handed me the keys. People say the building's got a history, but nothing to worry about, just some old stories. I chuckled, brushing it off. I'm not superstitious, I told her. Mrs. Matthews gave me a faint nod, though there was a hint of unease in her eyes as she closed the door behind me. For the first few days, everything was normal. I unpacked, organized, and settled into my new space. The neighborhood was quiet, with only the occasional car passing by on the street. But the longer I stayed there, the more I started to feel like something wasn't quite right. It began subtly, things out of place when I was sure I hadn't moved them, flickering lights and soft creaks from the hallway at night. I chalked it up to the building's age and figured it was just the normal noises of an old house. But then, on the fourth night, I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding in my chest. There was a sound in the apartment, soft, like someone was walking. Slowly. The floorboards creaked with each step, and I could hear the faint rustle of fabric brushing against the walls. I froze, wide-eyed, listening. The footsteps continued, deliberately moving from one end of the hallway to the other. Then there was a soft knocking at my bedroom door. I swallowed hard, my breath shallow. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice trembling. No response. I got up, my legs unsteady, and crept toward the door. I cracked it open a few inches, but found nothing. The hallway was empty. My pulse was racing, and I quickly closed the door, locking it behind me. The next morning, I went to see Mrs. Matthews. She was sitting in her chair by the window, knitting, when I knocked softly on her door. Her face was kind, though there was something distant about her. "I'm not sure if this is normal," I said, nervously. "I think something's going on in the apartment. Last night I heard footsteps, someone walking around, and there was knocking at the door." She looked at me quietly for a moment, her knitting needles paused mid-motion. "It's always been like that," she said softly. "This building, it's been through a lot. Some say it's haunted, but most of the people who've lived here have just learned to live with it. I didn't want to mention it before, but I suppose you should know. This building, it's not always empty." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Matthews sighed, her expression somber. "There was a man who used to live here a long time ago. He died in the building under strange circumstances. They say his spirit never left. Over the years, a lot of people have heard the footsteps, the knocking, even whispers in the hall. Some say it's just the old pipes, but I know better. I've lived here too long." I didn't know what to say. I thought she was just trying to explain away something I didn't understand, to make it sound less frightening. But the more I thought about it, the more the idea that something might be there, something not living, started to creep into my mind. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the soft creak of the floorboards, like someone was pacing outside my door. I lay in bed, clutching the blankets, and tried to ignore it, but the sound wouldn't stop. It was like the figure was waiting for something, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I finally gathered the courage to open the door again, just enough to peer into the hallway. But, once more, it was empty. Nothing but the dim light from the flickering bulb at the far end of the hall. I decided I would leave, at least for the night. I wasn't sure if it was nerves or if I had truly experienced something I couldn't explain, but I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. I packed a bag and went to stay at a friend's house. When I returned the next evening, everything seemed normal. No strange sounds, no knocking at the door, no footsteps in the hall. I felt foolish for letting my imagination get the best of me. I had been spooked by old stories, and the building was just old, nothing more. But that night, as I sat in bed reading, something caught my eye. The door to the hallway was ajar, just a crack. I was sure I had closed it before, and the only way it could have opened was if someone had done it. But I hadn't heard anyone move. The air felt cold, and I noticed, almost in passing, a shadow moving at the edge of my vision. I looked again, and it was gone. The next few days passed in a haze of unease. I kept hearing things, whispers, soft thumps, and even the occasional low hum of a voice coming from the hallway. Though I couldn't make out the words, I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. Then, one evening, as I was sitting in the living room, the temperature in the apartment dropped. I glanced at the thermostat. It was reading 65 degrees, but it felt much colder. My breath was visible in the air, and a chill ran down my spine. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang from behind me. I spun around to see that the picture frame on the wall had fallen to the floor. The glass shattered. I stood there staring at it, my heart thumping in my chest. It was as though the force of the sound had come from nowhere. I knelt down and picked up the frame, feeling a cold breeze wash over me as I did. That's when I saw it. In the reflection of the broken glass, there was a figure standing behind me. A man, with hollow eyes, his face pale and gaunt. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound came out. I jumped back, the frame slipping from my hand and crashing to the floor again. I turned to face the empty room, but the man was gone. The coldness in the air remained, but the figure had vanished. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my things the very next day and left the building behind. Mrs. Matthews was gone by then, and I never heard from her again. I've moved several times since, always staying far away from places like that. I don't know if the man who haunted that building was the spirit of someone who died there, or if the building itself had something to do with it. I don't think I ever want to know. But every so often, when I walk into a room that feels unnaturally cold, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me. And when I lie down at night, sometimes I still hear the soft creak of footsteps echoing in the silence. Story the end.
Story number 10.
I never believed in ghosts, at least not until the summer I spent at my aunt's farmhouse. It wasn't anything particularly special. The farmhouse had been in the family for generations, sitting quietly on the outskirts of a small town, nestled between fields that stretched on for miles. I had visited the house many times as a child, and it was always a place where I felt safe. But that summer, everything changed. I was in my early 20s and had recently taken a break from university. My aunt, who was a quiet, no-nonsense woman in her 50s, invited me to stay with her for a while. She was kind but very private, and I had always admired her independence. I was looking forward to the peace and solitude of the countryside. The first few days were peaceful enough. The farmhouse was old, with creaky floors and a smell of aged wood, but it had a charm about it. My aunt and I spent our days in the garden, picking vegetables, tending to the animals, and having quiet dinners on the back porch. But one night, something happened that I couldn't explain. I had stayed up late reading in my room, a cozy space with wooden beams and a small window that overlooked the fields. It was nearly midnight when I finally put the book down and turned off the lamp. The house was silent, save for the faint sounds of the night breeze rustling the leaves outside. I pulled the covers up and tried to sleep, but just as I was drifting off, I heard it. A soft, distinct knock on my door. I sat up in bed, startled. My heart raced for a moment. Maybe it was my aunt. She sometimes checked in on me at night to make sure I was all right. But the knock came again. 3 light raps, followed by silence. I hesitated, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe I had imagined it, but I wasn't the kind of person to be easily spooked, so I shook off the feeling and got up to answer the door. When I opened it, there was no one there. The hallway was dark, just the dim light from the staircase casting shadows across the floor. I looked both ways, but it was empty. I shrugged, thinking maybe my aunt had knocked and forgotten to wait for an answer. Still feeling uneasy, I went back to bed and pulled the covers tight around me. I convinced myself that it was just the house settling, or perhaps a figment of my imagination. The next morning, over breakfast, I asked my aunt if she had knocked on my door the night before. She looked at me, puzzled. "No, I didn't," she said, sipping her coffee. "I was asleep by 9. I didn't press the issue further, but the unease lingered in the back of my mind. The next few nights, the knocks returned. At first, it was just 1 or 2 taps, barely audible. But then it grew more insistent. 3 knocks, followed by silence, then a faint scraping sound on the wood floor outside my room. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. It was as if the house itself was trying to get my attention. One evening, I decided to confront whatever it was. I waited until after dinner when my aunt went to bed. The house was quiet, and I sat on the couch in the living room, trying to calm my nerves. I stared at the door leading into the hallway, willing myself to ignore the creeping feeling that something was lurking in the shadows. The knock came again. This time I didn't hesitate. I stood up, my breath shallow, and made my way to the door. My hand gripped the brass handle, and I flung it open. The hallway was empty, but something was different. At the end of the hallway, in the dim light of the moon that filtered through the window, I saw a figure. It was a woman, pale, with dark hair falling loosely around her shoulders. She stood motionless, her back to me, facing the stairs that led to the second floor. I froze in place, heart hammering in my chest. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move, didn't respond, but I could feel her presence. It was as if she was waiting for me to come closer. I felt a compulsion, an invisible pull to approach her, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I was rooted to the spot, my mind racing. I took a cautious step forward, and that's when the woman turned. Her face was pale, hollow, with dark, sunken eyes. There was no expression on her face, no emotion, just emptiness. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. She extended a hand toward me, her fingers long and thin, like they might snap at any moment. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut with a force that made the entire house shake. I whipped around, my pulse racing, but when I turned back, the figure was gone. The hallway was empty. I ran downstairs to my aunt's room, my legs weak beneath me. I pounded on her door, frantic, but she didn't answer. I knocked harder, my breath coming in sharp gasps. Finally, she opened the door, her face full of confusion. "What is it?" she asked. There was someone in the hallway," I stammered. "A woman. She was just standing there." My aunt's expression changed. For the first time since I had arrived, I saw something in her eyes. Fear, or perhaps something deeper, something she hadn't shared with me. "You shouldn't have seen her," she said, her voice tight. "Come inside, and I'll tell you everything." I followed her into her room, sitting on the edge of her bed. She closed the door softly behind me and turned to face me. "That woman you saw," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Her name was Margaret. She was your great-grandmother's sister. She died in this house a long time ago, many years before you were born." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "Margaret was a restless soul," my aunt continued. "She died in the upstairs bedroom. The story goes that she was never able to move on. They say she's been haunting the house ever since." I was in shock. The woman I had seen wasn't a figment of my imagination, wasn't some strange hallucination. She had been real. "The knocking you've been hearing," my aunt said, her voice trembling slightly, "it's her way of trying to get someone's attention. She's been trying to reach out, to be heard." "But why me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My aunt shook her head. "I don't know. Maybe it's because you're family. Maybe it's because she never had a chance to say goodbye. But you need to be careful. Margaret won't hurt you, but she's desperate for something." I didn't know what to say. My mind was spinning. It felt like everything I knew had been turned upside down in the span of a few minutes. That night, I stayed in my aunt's room. The house was eerily quiet, as though it was holding its breath, waiting. I didn't hear the knocks again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from the shadows. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed my things in a hurry, not telling my aunt where I was going. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. The house was beautiful, yes, but it was also filled with memories and ghosts that I couldn't comprehend. My aunt understood, though. She knew that sometimes the past doesn't let go so easily. As I drove away from the farmhouse, I couldn't help but look back. The house sat quietly on the hill, just as it always had. But in my mind, I knew there was something more there, something I couldn't see. I don't know if Margaret is still there, if she's still waiting for someone to hear her story, but I've never returned to that farmhouse. And every time I close my eyes at night, I wonder if the knocking will start again. Story the end.